There are a lot of things I like about abstract games, and I've played enough of them at this point that I'm starting to get a clear picture of what sets certain games apart for me. It goes without saying that a lot of abstract games can seem similar on the surface. You can probably play at least 100 different games with a Go board and some black and white stones, but these games all have subtle differences in their rules which can result in massively different feeling games. Today I'm going to talk about 3 games that each seem very similar on the surface, but due to how the rules and incentives of each game are tuned, result in a completely different feel. I'm going to compare these games and then conclude with my personal reasons for why I like some of these games more than the others. But I want to note up front that this is not a review. I don't assign games rankings or scores on this channel, I just like to talk. So, let's talk about Ponte del Diavolo. Ponte del Diavolo is a 2007 game designed by Martin Abel. It was designed as a tribute to Alex Randolph and is probably directly inspired by his game Twixt, which involved placing pegs on a board and then connecting them with horizontal pieces. Much like the game Hex, Twixt had the ultimate goal of connecting opposite sides of the board. However, the connections in Ponte del Diavolo are a little more fractured. Instead of connecting a path from one end to the other, at the end of the game the connections are scored independently depending on their size. In Ponte del Diavolo, players alternate turns placing either 2 tiles on the board or 1 bridge to connect their tiles. The ultimate goal is to create and connect islands of your color on the board. An island is a group of 4 tiles, and the more islands you have connected to each other, the higher your endgame score will be. There are a few restrictions to how tiles can be placed, so let's cover these quickly. An island is a group of exactly 4 tiles, connected to each other by their edges. They can take different shapes, but they must be exactly 4 tiles. Anything less than 4 tiles is considered a sandbank, and it's very important to understand that in this game a sandbank can grow into an island, but an island can never be touching a sandbank. And islands of the same color can also never touch each other. That includes diagonally touching, by the way. And while we're on the topic of sandbanks, 2 more quick things. Sandbanks can touch each other, but if a tile was ever placed in a way that would join them together and thus create an island that was larger than 4 tiles, that placement would be illegal. Also, islands can be connected to each other if a bridge goes through a valid sandbank. The sandbank won't count for the points, but it does count as a valid point of connection between 2 other islands. Instead of placing 2 tiles, a player may instead place a bridge to connect 2 of their tiles. In order to do this, the space underneath the bridge must be empty. This implies, of course, that a tile can never be placed underneath a bridge. Players will continue playing until one player can no longer make a legal placement, which will trigger the endgame. Scores are then calculated per connected group of islands that each player has. 1 island is worth 1 point, a second island in the same connection is worth 2 points, the third island is worth 3 points, so on and so forth. Each group of islands is scored separately, with any single islands not connected just being worth 1 point. Whoever has the most points at the end will win the game. There's so much I want to say about this game, but let's start with the idea of negative space. I think this is the first hurdle a new player will face when they first play Ponte del Diavolo. Understanding the negative space in this game is key to improving your strategy. Completing an island feels great. Indeed, it's what you must do in order to score points. But as soon as you complete an island, you also define a border around it in which your opponent can place tiles uncontested. You can block some of these spaces with bridges, of course, but understanding and controlling that negative space plays an incredibly key role in attaining victory. Secondly, and this is the thing that's going to tie this entire video together, is this idea of the A-B turn structure. What I mean by that is Ponte del Diavolo is a game where you have two choices on your turn. You can either do A or you can do B. You cannot do both. You can either place 2 tiles or you can place 1 bridge. And if the consequence of that isn't immediately obvious, let me spell it out for you. Placing a bridge in Ponte del Diavolo is a tempo loss. The A-B turn structure is something that I've come to really admire in games like this, and Ponte del Diavolo is one of the brightest shining examples of why it works so damn well. There's so much more to this choice than might first appear. To understand why this is so interesting, we have to talk about this concept of the expansion and consolidation paradox and why it's so central to the tension in this game. In Ponte del Diavolo, you earn points via consolidation. You need to connect your islands with bridges in order to score, but in order to consolidate, you must expand. The thing is, although expansion is necessary, it's inherently risky. Placing a tile on the board is an invitation for your opponent to cut you off. Indeed, many times placing a tile on the board in Ponte del Diavolo feels like reaching out a hand only for your opponent to sever it. Since expansion is risky, consolidation feels like a safe play, but it comes at the expense of tempo, allowing your opponent to outpace you on board presence. So what's the solution? Well, good strategy would have you placing your tiles in secure footholds, but sometimes even the most secure placement is ripe for exploitation if you aren't careful. This is where the concept of the tempo loss is so incredibly important. A key to securing your own islands and connections in Ponte del Diavolo is by threatening your opponent's connections. If you're about to be blocked in, you might consider placing 1 tile to grow your own island and a 2nd tile to threaten one of your opponent's connections. Placing a tile in such a way will force them to take a tempo loss in order to secure their chain. Then, on your next turn, you can commit 2 more tiles towards your goal. This is just one example of the texture that A-B turn structure can allow. So yeah, placing a bridge in Ponte del Diavolo is necessary, but it comes with a loss. Forcing that loss on your opponent feels great, but you shouldn't only be placing bridges defensively. The absolute best time to place a bridge in Ponte is when you are simultaneously connecting your islands and blocking a potential connection for your opponent. Doing this can really balance out the tempo loss and lock in a secure foothold for yourself. Another way to talk about the expansion consolidation paradox is to talk about liability. A lot of games have liability, but in abstract games, that liability is strictly positional. Every piece you place on the board is an investment, and all of them require care and attention in order for them to pay out. So just like placing bridges too early can be a mistake, placing them too late can be even worse. If the tempo switches in favor of your opponent, you may be losing your investments left and right. What could have been a beautiful island chain instead becomes a group of disconnected sandbanks. Sad. So these concepts of positional liability, the A-B turn structure, and the expansion consolidation paradox are all in another game as well, and that game is Volo by Dieter Stein. In Volo, players are tasked with connecting their birds into a single flock. Each player starts with 3 pieces on the board, 1 each on alternating vertices. And on your turn, you can either place a new piece on the board, or you can move a bird or flock of birds in such a way that it combines into a larger group. Placement is a little tricky. You can place a piece anywhere on the board, but it cannot be touching one of your pre-existing pieces. Placing next to an opponent's piece is fine, but placing next to your own is not allowed. Moving is a little tricky as well. A bird or a group of birds can only move if it's in a straight line. The line can move in any direction until it hits an object, but it cannot change shape while moving. And of course, a move is only legal if it results in combining into a larger group. You can also reorganize a flock that isn't in a straight line by sliding a straight line segment of it in any direction, as long as it A, doesn't break the pre-existing flock, and B, results in a larger group by connecting to another bird or flock of birds. This is an uncommon but important rule to mention. If a player ever completely cuts off one side of the board, they must choose one section and remove all of their opponent's pieces from that section. This just means that it's impossible to force your opponent into a lose state by cutting their birds off. In fact, doing so would most definitely help your opponent, so it's probably wise to avoid doing that. And that's pretty much it for the rules. The first player to connect their birds into a single flock will win the game. It seems really simple, but what starts as 3 birds on the board will quickly expand into 4, 5, 6, then 10, as you and your opponent try to outflank and block each other, all the while attempting to connect those very pieces back into your flock. So, Volo and Ponte del Diavolo share a lot in common. They both operate with that A-B turn structure. They both deal with concepts of liability and the expansion consolidation paradox. Also, they both have Volo in their title, mind-blowing. So what makes Volo different? First of all, I absolutely love this game. Volo takes this idea of consolidation to an almost sadistic point. Not only must you connect all of your birds in order to win, you're not allowed to place a new bird next to a pre-existing bird. Unlike Ponte, where you can safely build adjacent to your own pieces while expanding, Volo says no, adjacent placements are for babies. The other thing that makes this game different is that in Volo, consolidation is an absolute requirement. In Ponte del Diavolo, consolidation is key to winning, but nothing is stopping you from having 2 or 3 distinct island chains. The key problem in Volo is that every piece must be connected in order for you to win, and that makes the consolidation even more pronounced than in Ponte. In Volo, if each player played 100% optimally to join their birds in the fewest moves possible, player 1 would win every time. So at some point, player 2 is going to have to throw out a blocking piece. And this immediately starts a chain reaction. Player 1 must attempt to circumvent the blocking piece, and player 2 must attempt to consolidate that blocking piece back into their group. This can result in some really beautiful shapes taking place as pieces naturally end up winding their way around each other. The thing that sets Volo distinctly apart from Ponte del Diavolo, however, is that the position of your birds isn't permanently fixed. This is the secret ingredient which gives Volo its distinct flavor and prevents it from basically being a game of hex. Flocks that are in a straight line can fly across the board, and you can reorganize your more complex flocks by sliding straight line portions of it, like some kind of bird mech suit, reaching out suddenly to surprise your opponent and connect a bird to your flock that they thought would never make it home. So despite having a lot in common, Volo and Ponte del Diavolo are quite distinct. Ponte's fixed placement balances out the fact that you're not required to connect all of your islands together. In Volo, the organic and sometimes surprising movement system means that the consolidation requirement will never lead to a stalemate. Both games have an A-B turn structure, both games deal with liability in interesting ways, but where Ponte del Diavolo feels like slamming bricks into a murky swamp where hopes and dreams go to die, Volo feels like organic, impermanent, and the lack of friction which allows surprise comebacks gives the game a sense of levity that Ponte doesn't have. And speaking of friction, let's talk about our final game. Actually, it's another game by Dieter Stein, and it's called Fendo. So, Fendo is yet another A-B turn structure game. In Fendo, you can either place a new pawn on the board, or you can move a pre-existing pawn to place a wall. The goal is to capture more territory on the board than your opponent, and territory is captured by having a single pawn of your color completely enclosed by walls. Movement is incredibly flexible in Fendo. Your pawns can slide as far as they want until they hit an object, but they are also allowed a single 90-degree turn in their movement. Placing a new pawn actually works the same way. A pawn must be spawned by a pre-existing pawn, and its placement follows the same rules as movement. a new pawn can be placed anywhere along the current pawn's movement path, which means you can place new pawns around corners, for example. As your pawns move around the board, you will be placing walls. Walls aren't owned by either player, but instead create the shared landscape that you will be fighting over. If you watched my review of Terra Nova, this game is very similar in that regard. A territory is only considered captured in this game when a single pawn is completely enclosed by walls. After the entire board is captured, players count up the squares in their respective territories, and whoever has captured more squares will win the game. As you can probably tell, there are a lot of similarities with Ponte del Diavolo and Volo, and a lot of differences too. In fact, Fendo is much more different than the previous two games we discussed. Despite sharing that A-B turn structure, Ponte del Diavolo and Volo have certain levels of friction to them. Ponte having fixed placement and Volo having non-fixed but limited movement options. Fendo, by contrast, is almost a frictionless game. Pieces on the board can move very freely, sliding as far as they can in one direction and even having that ability to turn 90 degrees before continuing their movement. Secondly, Fendo doesn't really deal with liability in the same way that Ponte and Volo do. That's not to say you aren't liable for your pieces in Fendo, it's just a little bit different. Instead of placing a piece on the board being a risk, in Fendo, placing a piece on the board is just another vector for control. However, the risk and the liability come in when determining which piece to move on which turn and which piece to leave in place, potentially allowing it to be trapped by your opponent. In Fendo, you want to claim as much territory as possible, but where there's expansion, there's no real need for consolidation. Your pieces don't need to be together in the same territory. In fact, they aren't allowed to be. And your fences, well, they aren't even yours. This is really interesting because it shifts the dynamic of the game from one of anxiety over sunk costs to one of pure tactical freedom. Instead of asking you to commit your pieces to the board, Fendo allows you to use your workforce however you see fit. Use them to block your opponents, line them up to form an impenetrable wall, zip them around a corner to surprise your opponent and disrupt their territory. Where Ponte and Volo are slower, plodding games of realizing your plans, Fendo is a light exercise in tactical flexibility. And this is great. There's a lightness to this game that doesn't exist in Ponte or Volo. It replaces all the anxiety of the first two games with a real sense of playfulness. Because of its lack of friction, things can move and change so much that to do well in Fendo, you just have to be flexible, bouncing between defense and offense with every move. Also, adding a new piece on the board isn't a tempo loss in Fendo. It's actually tempo neutral at best, especially because you can spit out that new pawn in a position where it blocks your opponent. Similarly to placing a bridge in Ponte that simultaneously connects your islands and blocks your opponent from connecting theirs, except that in Fendo, that piece isn't fixed in place. It can drop a fence and then move on to help defend territory somewhere else on the board. So these three games are all games that I love, but I love them for different reasons. And if I had to rank them by my enjoyment, they would probably be in the same order as if I ranked them by their brutality. Ponte del Diavolo is cruel. Its fixed placement, tempo considerations, and emphasis on liability make it an easy favorite of mine. It's high stakes, dramatic, and full of anxiety. I think this game has an incredible amount of depth, and it begs to be explored in a serious way. Volo is equal in Ponte's cruelty. The absolute requirement to consolidate your flock means every placement is a risky investment, and cashing out on that investment is a sigh of relief. But the flexibility with the movement softens the game a little bit. You never feel like you've been completely cut off, and in fact, you can't be completely cut off. Not only does the movement allow flexible rearrangement, but the rule that if your opponent cuts off a part of the board, they have to remove your pieces from one of the two halves, means the potential for being completely screwed over is significantly reduced. And then there's Fendo, which shares the same tension over that A-B turn structure, but which lacks the liability of Volo and the friction of Ponte. It has some excellent tension in deciding when it's best to place a fence and when you need to reinforce by placing a new pawn, but as a result of the shift in focus from high-stakes positional liability to something a little bit more free-form, the gameplay, while still great, feels a little bit less satisfying. I want to reiterate that none of these games are inherently better than the others. I firmly believe that whether or not you enjoy a game has nothing to do with its rating on BGG and everything to do with your brain chemistry. We're all unique and we all resonate with different things. A 6.2 on BGG could be a 10 for you, and there's many 8s on BGG that I would personally rate a 2 or 3. This is relevant because Ponte del Diavolo is currently sitting at a 6.5 on BGG. To a lot of people, that score would result in immediately clicking off the page. One thing I want to do on this channel is to encourage people to exit their comfort zones, to think for themselves, explore and define their own taste in games, and to fundamentally understand that personal taste is always going to be more important than a number on a website. And for me, I happen to be a bit of a sadomasochist when it comes to games. I like being punished just as much as I like doling out the punishment, so it's no surprise that Ponte del Diavolo is my ultimate favorite. And that makes a lot of sense, because whether it's an 18xx game or Reiner Knizia's best card game, liability and sunk cost and anxiety are things that I really value in games. But for those of you who are looking for a more tactical exercise in positioning or a bit of a fusion of the two games, I highly recommend Fendo and Volo as well. And as always, thanks for watching.